In 1928, the city authorized the building of a junior and senior high school on adjoining land parcels. This land was referred to in the newspapers as the Reno section, and it was proposed that the school be called Reno High School.
Wilson opened its doors on the 23rd of September, 1935, with a faculty of 30 and a student body of 750 pupils. The flag was raised for the first time on Armistice Day, November 11, 1935. At the school's dedication exercises, Mrs. Edith Wilson, the president's widow, was the honored guest. The school colors of green and white and the tiger mascot, modeled after the Princeton tiger, were chosen at this time. By the end of 1935, Wilson's school song had been selected after a contest. The song, called Sons of Wilson, was set to the tune of an old Welsh tune, Men of Harlech. Its foot-stomping refrain has always been a rallying point for displaying school spirit and tradition. During the first school year, a weekly school paper called the Wilson Beacon was named by a student vote. The editor-in-chief of the Beacon in this first year was a woman, and this seemed to set a precedent for choosing women editors for the Beacon as well as the yearbook. The first yearbook was published in 1937 to coincide with the school's first graduating class. The biggest activity outside of the classroom was to be a member of the Cadet Corps. Approximately half of the male students during the 30s and the early 1940s were members of the Cadet Corps. The makeup of the Cadet Corps consisted of a regiment with 2 battalions, 5 companies, and a band. Each company and the band had a female sponsor. In addition, there was a rifle team, officers' club, chevron club, and cadet club. The popularity of fraternities and sororities at the college level spawned their junior counterparts in the district's public high schools. Before a fraternity or sorority could be recognized as a legitimate school activity, it had to be approved by the city's Board of Education. At their height, there were some 20 fraternities and sororities at Wilson. These groups offered their members a social calendar outside of school. Over time, these groups lost their Board of Education approval ratings and began a slow downward trend until they disappeared from Wilson in the early 1970s. Wilson has always had a strong sports program. In those early years, boys' sports featured football, lightweight football, basketball, golf, swimming, tennis, and baseball. In addition to football, varsity teams were established for basketball, golf, swimming, tennis, and baseball. Girls' sports were not taken as seriously, since they consisted primarily of classes and intramural teams rather than inter-high team competitions.
Beginning in the early 1940s, Wilson was fast gaining the reputation of being one of the best public high schools in the country. During the 40s, the student body increased to over 1,000 students. The increase necessitated establishing 2 more house designations: Geneva House for President Wilson's involvement in the founding of the League of Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, and Columbia House, named for the District of Columbia and the White House. The purpose of assigning students to houses was to allow them to identify with smaller groups of students and to build school spirit within a larger school environment. Also, it helped spark rivalries in intramural sports. The normalcy that was so evident in 1940 and the early part of 1941 was shattered on December 7, 1941, with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into World War II. The impact was immediate. Students began preparing to enlist in the armed forces as soon as they graduated. In some cases, they weren't waiting for graduation. They went to their draft boards to enlist. They would finish high school after they were discharged from the service. While the students were going into the armed services, the male members of the faculty were also being drafted or enlisting. Before long, Wilson had almost an all-female faculty. It was a common sight to see young men in uniform around the school grounds. Graduates and their friends would stop by to talk to friends and relate their experiences. Throughout the war, the student body, teachers, and administrators pitched in to support the war effort. Being in the Cadet Corps took on new meaning. This included the ranks of the recently formed Girl Cadets. Everyone became interested in world geography and world history. There were war bond and back the attack drives to raise money. Students could buy war bond stamp books at the school bank, and when the books were full, they could be traded in for a war bond. There were food and clothing drives to send these items overseas and special assemblies on patriotic themes with guest speakers. A course in international Morse code was offered to students because of the great need for radio operators in both civilian and military life. When it was all over in August 1945, well over 1,000 Wilson students had served in the armed forces. 67 sons of Wilson did not come back. They made the ultimate sacrifice in defense of their country. After the war, student life continued as before. The number of clubs and organizations exploded after 1945. The girls' sports program, though still intramural, began to expand with the addition of more sports. Ice skating classes were introduced in the early 1940s, as well as bowling. Classes would be held at the Chevy Chase Ice Palace on Connecticut Avenue, with ice skating on the upper level and bowling alleys on the lower level. Now that the war was over and cars were more plentiful, the number of cars being driven to and from school jumped. These usually were the students' parents' cars. However, there were still a number of boys who liked buying old model cars and enjoyed giving these jalopies a new lease on life. The boys' varsity teams program had settled in by the early 40s. The big team sports of football, basketball, baseball, track were fielding competitive teams with an occasional winning season. Basketball and football were a little more successful than baseball. The track team was beginning to establish a winning tradition during the decade by gaining the inter-high title a number of years in a row. This was also true of the golf and tennis team. By the late 1940s, casual dress was the uniform of the day. The decade of the 40s ended on an upbeat note. Wilson's football team won its first inter-high championship, beating McKinley Tech 21-20. The team went on to play Gonzaga for the public parochial high school city championship. Gonzaga won 12-7 in Griffith Stadium.
In the fall of 1950, Dr. John Brower became Wilson's new principal. He served until the spring of 1959. In the meantime, Wilson's long-standing music program continued to be recognized as the best in the city. The orchestra would tour the city, giving concerts under the direction of Mr. Essers, who also organized a concert band to perform some of the more popular selections of the day. The Cadet Corps, now somewhat smaller than in previous years, still maintained an active schedule. It participated in Armistice Day ceremonies, the awarding of commissions at the National Guard Armory, and marching in the Armed Forces Day Parade. In the girls' intramural sports program, field hockey continued to be the #1 girls' sport. Hundreds would turn out every season. Its popularity throughout the city led to an inter-high tournament where Wilson won all of its games in the first tournament held in 1951. It was now possible for girls to earn sport participation points. As they accumulated points, they would be awarded sports letters. The two sports programs were growing closer together in recognizing athletic talent. 1951 was the year driver's ed was added to the school's curriculum. Students interested in getting their driver's licenses as soon as they turned 16 couldn't wait to sign up for the course. By far the biggest sports triumph of the decade occurred in the late autumn of 1952 when the football team completed an undefeated season, beating Western's Raiders 41-16 for the title and then conquering St. John's 24-6 for the city championship. There were two events during the 1950s whose impact would reach far beyond Wilson's campus. The first of these was the Korean War, which began a week after graduation in June 1950. Hostilities were finally concluded in 1953. As in the previous war, several hundred graduates served in the armed forces during this period and immediately thereafter. 14 Wilsonites did not make it back from Korea. The second event's impact is still being felt today. In 1954, the Supreme Court, in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, ruled that segregated public school systems were unconstitutional. Wilson remained a predominantly segregated school until the late 60s. By the early 70s, Wilson had the most diverse student body in the city for several reasons. The school boundaries had been expanded. Open enrollment was introduced, and the busing plan was put into action in order to bring students to Wilson from other parts of the city. Even today, Wilson still has a diverse student body.
The new decade ushered in changes for Wilson's publications. The yearbook staff wanted to make format and style changes that had not been made since the publication's first year back in 1937. Yearbook covers began to appear in color, while the inside pages contained more pictures in more casual settings. Color spreads were also created between the covers. By the late 1960s, the yearbook contained pictures of friends, homeroom classes, and groups with interesting poses and captions. Not to be left out, the Beacon staff wanted to take advantage of new printing techniques that would allow the Beacon to be larger and use color on occasion. The interest to be seen in print brought about the introduction of Lines, a booklet that was published periodically to showcase students' poems, essays, and creative writings. One of Wilson's greatest strengths has been its student organizations. Administrators and teachers over the years have encouraged students with a common interest to form a club or a group to explore that interest. With such encouragement, hardly a year would go by without a few new organizations appearing on the campus. By the 1960s, there were so many groups they could now be grouped into categories such as science and math, language, and honor and service organizations. The honor societies, such as the National Honor Society, Latin Honor Society, the Quill and Scroll, and the Math Honor Society, would induct members with high scholastic achievement. This reservoir of talent made it possible to have winning teams on the popular TV program, It's Academic. Community service has always been a Wilson tradition, and in the 1960s, a new group of service-oriented groups joined the long-serving clubs, such as Y-Teens, Junior Red Cross, Key Club, and the Student Government, which was the new name for the Student Council. Wilson's music program, under the direction of Mr. Pappas, kept reinventing itself. The instrumental groups now included a stage band as well as a symphonic orchestra, which would accompany the choral group at assemblies. Country and folk music were beginning to join the musical mainstream, and their popularity created Wilson's second performing showcase in the Boys and Girls Gyms. Musicians and singers would hold song fests after school, with the crowds joining in. As the popularity of these gatherings grew, it was apparent a new venue was needed. The basement armory, which had fallen into disuse, was transformed into Wilson's own coffee house. The place was wildly popular. It served soft drinks, pizza, and, of course, coffee. Initially called Pub 68, its name was changed to the Wilson Pub. Some of the musical groups that made regular appearances were The Ark, Ethos, Mother, and Primrose. The 1960s were a troubling and disturbing decade for many Americans. For the third time in as many decades, the United States went to war, this time in Vietnam. This turned out to be America's longest war, lasting from 1963 to 1975. And, as in previous wars, Wilson's boys responded to the call. In addition to this unpopular war, the civil rights and feminist movements were in full swing and crowding the public's consciousness. To this decade, crowded with discontent and war, came the tragedy of the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy. The country was in constant turmoil because of these events, and Wilson was not immune. Students, faculty, and administrators all had conflicted feelings during this period. Change would not be long in coming.
The student government, which would rename itself Student Council later in the decade, sensed that change was in the air and decided to lead the way. Things had to be done differently. It established a political action committee and a student court. The court was a means for students who were experiencing difficulties at school to have their complaints heard by an objective peer group. The events sponsored by the council also changed. Now there were rock concerts, puppet shows, movies, a walk for hunger, along with periodic visits from a drugmobile unit to inform students about the effects of drugs. And students were now able to receive tutoring in all subjects. There was also WWHS, the school's in-house radio station, which offered an array of news items and music during the homeroom period. In 1974, the council made the ultimate change. It elected 4 women to fill its leadership positions. Times were really changing. It was a time of experimentation. The Wilson Players adapted the basement armory into a theater in the round format and put on a series of plays, including USA and Death of Betty Smith. The yearbook editors, not content to follow the previous year's practices, started calling the yearbook the Manse off and on during the decade. Chronicling each year's events with narratives and pictures was modified. Pictures were in, and storylines were out. The Beacon suffered the most during the early 70s. There was a new faculty sponsor every year, and as a result, editorial content suffered. A goodly portion of the paper's reporting during the early 70s concentrated on the bureaucratic haggling and the troubles of the D.C. public school system and the Board of Education. As expected, students stopped subscribing to the paper. In order to help out with the paper's financial woes, the teachers put on the faculty follies to raise money. Assistant Principal Michael Durso was one of the featured performers. Editorial content and quality began to get back on track by the mid-70s. The mood of the student body was probably best captured in the school's annual literary magazine, Lines, which in the 1960s had been renamed Skyfields. The essays, poems, and ramblings reflected a darker side of student life. As in the late 60s, student unrest was still evident around campus. 2 groups that seemed to go unheralded year after year were the bridge and chess clubs. Both were small in numbers but big in winning competitions and tournaments. Construction sites and noise were an ever-present condition in the Tenleytown neighborhood during the entire 1970s. In addition to Wilson's expansion plans, the city had been tearing up streets all around Washington for a subway system. In 1976, the metro system opened its first operating line, the Red Line, just a block from Wilson at Tenleytown. The station was a boon for those students who had to travel great distances to get to school. In 1978, a second sports complex was added, an aquatic center. The facility was open to the public as well as for school use. It had an Olympic-sized swimming pool and diving platform and a waiting area for small children, plus a locker and shower facility. At about the same time, the passage of Title IX requiring schools to put more money into women's athletic programs sparked interest in girls' sports programs. The city now had a girls' basketball league, and Wilson was playing in it. In 1972, the team reached the championship round. On the other side of the ledger, Wilson was continuing to maintain its high academic standards. Graduates continued to distinguish themselves in the Merit Scholars Program. The newly established National Achievement Scholarship Program for outstanding Negro students recognized Wilson graduates every year. The school's Its Academic team had a large reservoir of talent to choose from. It held its own week after week on this popular TV show and advanced to the semifinal round in 1979. In the realm of student fashions, the 70s unleashed the greatest unconventional conformity the school had ever seen. Hair length for both boys and girls kept getting longer and longer as the decade wore on. Girls' skirts kept getting shorter, and miniskirts were seen everywhere. The afro hairstyle was very popular. It grew in size during the early and mid-70s and came back down in size by the late 70s. So did the hair length for all male students. Many of the boys sported long sideburns or mutton chops, while some grew beards and mustaches. Jeans and slacks were worn by everyone. Turtleneck sweaters were a popular item, as were outerwear jackets of all kinds. Girls wore their hair long, stringy, flowing down their backs in some cases. By the end of the 1970s, hairstyles had become short once again and were showing signs of being combed. Beads were seen in abundance. Headbands could also be spotted. Big purses were making their way onto campus, and boots were very popular. For the first time, teachers started wearing the same fashions as students. Male faculty members let their hair grow long, wore afro styles, cultivated beards and mustaches, slipped into jeans and outdoor jackets, and wore turtlenecks. Women faculty members sported afro hairstyles and wore pantsuits, jeans, or miniskirts. All in all, Wilson, Washington, and the country had not seen a decade like the 70s.
By the time the 1980s rolled around, the rhetoric and social activism of the 60s and 70s had begun to fade. The change could best be seen in the way the students looked and dressed. The afros, the mutton sideburns, beards, and mustaches had given way to close-cropped hair and clean-shaven faces. The early 80s also introduced Wilson to the computer age. When the school received its first computers, there were lively discussions as to who would get them. In the meantime, everyone kept working on their typing skills. By the late 90s, Wilson was totally wired for computers and the Internet. By far, the biggest comeback was the Cadet Corps, which had totally lost its following during the 70s. With new uniforms and a new name, the Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps, or JROTC, now included female as well as male students. The rifle and drill teams were reestablished, along with a ranger contingent. One of the most popular changes that occurred in the early 80s was the emergence of Wilson's fashion club, Satiny. Now, Satiny was founded by Mrs. Barbara Hunter in 1979 when it conducted its first assembly presentation. In several years' time, Satiny was one of the most anticipated performance presentations at Wilson. Satiny members are instructed to make their own fashions and model these during talent assemblies and special showings. Members also learn poise, manners, good grooming, clothing fashion technology, and choreography for stage and runway presentations. Wilson's strong choral program expanded in the 80s to include a group of madrigal singers. The singers designed their own costumes, typical of medieval dress, and sang songs that were popular during the Middle Ages. Wilson's choral music program's highest accolade during the decade came when the choir was invited to compete in the 14th International Music Festival held in Vienna, Austria. The week-long event featured choral groups and orchestras from around the world. In addition to competing, Wilson's singers had a chance to travel around Austria and give recitals in a number of cities. Wilson's choir placed fourth in the overall competition, despite the fact that it was the youngest and the only amateur group there. Funds were scarce for Wilson's players during the decade. As a result, most plays were limited to one act. These included the Erpenham Camp and I Am Herbert. Money was also in short supply for the school's athletic program. The lack of money, a coaching shortage, and unmotivated players made it tough going for many varsity teams. To help alleviate the financial bind and raise school spirits, Wilson's faculty offered to play charity basketball games with the Washington Redskins, the Super Bowl champions in 1983 and 84. Everybody knew who would win. That really didn't matter because the two-game series was played before packed fieldhouse crowds, and Wilson benefited by the infusion of money into his athletic program. There was always homecoming to look forward to. The week leading up to the game was now called Spirit Week, and each day had a theme, with Friday being Green and White Day. By Saturday morning, everybody was ready for the festivities. There would be the morning parade of floats, car caravans, and marching groups. After that would come the cheerleaders with pom-poms revving up the crowds in the stands. At halftime, the activities centered around crowning the homecoming king and queen. And on Saturday night, there would be the big dance at the Shoreham Hotel. The decade spawned a number of new organizations, including the Russian, Pottery, and Sign Language clubs and the Speech and Debate team. The debate team sent 3 debaters to the Grand National Tournament in its first year. The school instituted a number of programs in the 1980s that were intended to enrich students' learning experiences during their 3-year stay at Wilson. One such program that was well established by the 80s was the school's Its Academic team. This team, which had been besting other area high schools in the weekly TV show, now had girls on the team. Credit for the success of this program goes to Mr. John Glaze. The largest enrichment program was and still is WISP, Wilson's International Studies Program. The program is open to all high school students in the city who can qualify for it. Course assignments include Modern European History, International Studies, Choice of a Foreign Language, and weekly lectures from the city's diplomatic corps and area university faculty. Students also visit another country for a year under the auspices of the Youth for Understanding and Youth Ambassadors program.
During the 1990s, Wilson's administrators, faculty, and students were spending much of their time getting ready to meet the challenges of the 21st century. By the late 90s, the entire school had been wired for computers. A website had been established, and surfing on the internet was a reality. One group of students intimately involved in the conversion process were members of the Computer Club, who assisted volunteer business professionals in making the changeover. These changes and others were coordinated by Wilson's last 2 principals of the century. Dr. Wilma Bonner came to Wilson in the fall of 1990 and departed in the winter of 1998. In the spring of 1999, she was succeeded by Dr. Stephen Terrason. Wilson students have always been interested in exploring new avenues. In the past, the interests were centered around school-related activities or providing assistance to community-based programs. However, these interests changed in the 1990s. The country's unresolved social issues and America's role as the dominant partner in the Hall of Nations brought about a whole new set of student organizations and programs. Students wanted to know more about their country and the world they were about to enter. They formed groups to give them first-hand experience in issues of the day. Interest in highlighting Wilson's diverse student body helped establish the Islamic Culture Club, the Back to Africa Club, and the Hispanic Heritage Assemblies, as well as the Latin American Youth Club. All of these organizations heightened interest in Wilson's long-standing foreign exchange program, which would bring foreign students to live in the homes of Wilson students and attend classes. At the same time, small groups of Wilson students would go abroad for short periods. Regular pronouncements in the media of scientific and technological advancements spoke to the wisdom of establishing an Academy of Science, Math, and Technology to go along with Wilson's strong international studies program. The third academy to be established as the decade was drawing to a close was the Academy of Business and Finance in partnership with the U.S. Treasury Department. An annual event that helped to call attention to the subjects studied by the students enrolled in the Science, Math, and Technology Academy was the city's annual science fair. Each year, Wilson's entrants came away with top prizes in the various fair categories, as well as recognition bestowed by the area's scientists. The instrumental program was energized when Mr. K. Dickerson joined the faculty. His interest in establishing a high-stepping marching band brought out streams of interested students. The band is now an integral part of Wilson's music and sports programs. In 1997, Wilson's Alumni Association held a memorial assembly to honor the 7 sons of Wilson who lost their lives in the Vietnam War. They dedicated a plaque to their memory. This plaque, commemorating these 7, as well as the plaque remembering the 14 Korean War dead, are located in the foyer area adjacent to the auditorium. The 90s ushered in Wilson's golden decade of sports. It all started with the football teams of the early 90s. By far, the athletic program's winningest teams were the girls' swim teams, the Tiger Sharks. By the end of the decade, the teams had established a 22-year dynasty as city champions. The boys' swim teams were also experiencing championship seasons throughout the mid to late 90s. The girls' volleyball teams, which had been gathering city titles during the 80s, regained their form by the mid-90s, taking consecutive city honors during the mid and late 90s. Last but not least, the boys' baseball teams, under coach Eddie Sa, set a DC Public High School record of 111 consecutive victories while taking 7 city titles in the process. The spectacular success of all these varsity teams was only half the story. There were just as many other teams whose records, while not outstanding, were always competitive, winning a divisional or city title now and then. When combined, Wilson's boys and girls varsity sports programs were and still are the most competitive and comprehensive athletic programs in the DC public school system. Everything considered, the 1990s seemed to be the best of times for Wilson's students and faculty. Since it first opened its doors 65 years ago, the school has continued to offer an academic and extracurricular program to challenge any student. Today, Wilson still offers the most comprehensive learning experience of any public high school in the city. As a testimony to this, every year, hundreds of parents from outside Wilson's boundaries line up to register their children for the few open slots allotted to students from across the district. And each year, the vast majority of its graduates attend institutions of higher learning. Those who have gone on before can continue to be proud of having attended one of the premier urban public high schools in the country.